Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Vote versus vote, legitimacy versus legitimacy. During the course of a week, Ukraine has experienced two election cycles with very different outcomes. One appears to support war, the other peace. Has Ukraine formalized its separate ways? To crosstalk the elections in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. Also in London, we have Dmitry Linik. He is the head of the London Bureau of Voice of Russia. And in Brussels, we cross to Gilbert Doctaro. He is the founder of the European Office on the Committee on East-West Accord, as well as a commentator on international affairs with a focus on Russia. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Marcus, if I can go to you in London, after these two elections here, all you hear out of the echo chamber is legitimacy, legitimacy. Somebody has it and somebody doesn't have it. And of course, they're saying that the Poroshenko regime and the parties that ran out of Kiev, they have legitimacy. People in the Donbass don't, though both went to the ballot box here. But one of the things before we discuss the meaning and consequences of these votes, it seems to me that if we want to talk about the word legitimacy, we have to go back to the original sin, and that is the coup in Kiev in February. But the West doesn't like to talk about it.
Absolutely. Let's just remind ourselves why we're here today with this crisis in Ukraine. Because this February, a democratically elected leader whose victory in 2010 was recognised by the United States and the European Union was overthrown in a pro-Western engineered coup. That effectively brought the crisis on in Ukraine, and that effectively destroyed Ukraine's unity as it was previously known. So the West can talk about legitimacy, but it's very selective with that. And the recent elections in Donetsk and Lugansk were, in fact, an absolute triumph for democracy. And how was that so? Because hundreds of thousands of people voted in Lugansk. Nearly 1 million people voted in Donetsk. They voted to elect a leader to run their own affairs. This May, the populations of Donetsk and Lugansk once again voted in their hundreds of thousands to have independence. Never again do those two regions want to be in Kiev's fold. And why is that? Because following the coup this February against Viktor Yanukovych, a tidal wave of violence was perpetrated against the Russian-speaking communities of southeastern Ukraine. And the Ukrainian government was complicit in that, and the West was complicit in that. So it's little wonder that the people in Donetsk and Lugansk never ever again want to have anything to do with Kiev. No self-respecting people in the world would tolerate pogroms committed against them and then want to remain part of the system in the country which perpetrated those atrocities against them.
Dmitry, if I go to you in London here, it appears here, and if you can look at the broader picture here, elections only have legitimacy if the Washington consensus supports it. I mean, the direct democracy that we saw in the Donbass is very clear. It's very clear to see, and it's unquestionable that that there are people doing it because of their own volition, but because it doesn't get the stamp out of Washington and Brussels, it's illegitimate.
Well, there's one other thing that I would like to invoke in connection with legitimacy or otherwise. If we could go rewind back slightly to 1999, we'll recall that the West was out to support the desire of the population of Kosovo, a majority of the population of Kosovo, obviously, against Belgrade. So what did it do? It mounted a military campaign against Belgrade to secure the right of the people of Kosovo to a vote for independence. Now, if we draw a parallel with the situation in Ukraine, the course would be for military action against Kiev, which is suppressing East Ukraine's right to vote for independence. Okay. And that's a precedent.
Yeah, but
I mean, no parallel is perfect,
no, Dmitry.
of course.
You're throwing logic in the face of Washington. They don't like that. You're offending their sensibilities because you won't follow the narrative. A very good point you brought up there, Gilbert. I mean, again, if we use the logic of the West, when the coup happened, in Kiev. Brussels and Washington should have instantly sanctioned that regime because it overthrew a democratically elected government. But they didn't, did they?
Peter, I'd like to move the discussion to a different set of words.
Okay.
We've focused attention on legitimacy. Indeed, that was top of mind going into the elections and conducting the elections. Now they're over. And I think the two words that come to mind, certainly the words you hear around the corridors of power in the EU, is sanctions and war. Because the question going into this, would the EU, would the United States intensify its sanctions if the elections in Donbass were held and if Russia recognized the results? That question is very topical at this moment. The second question is, and this was also present going into the elections, would they result in a resumption of the war? Was Kiev, or for that matter, were the insurgents preparing to pursue the war, prosecute the war, once the elections were over and their hands were freed up? And these are the items that people are deliberating over right now.
Okay, Marcus, the interesting thing about the outcome of the election that Kiev held is that it moved not only the political system but the discourse very much to the right. We have the oligarchs and we have neo-Nazis that will sit in that parliament now. There are no other voices. You know, I'd like to quote John Kerry here. He said after the election, "We applaud Ukraine's commitment to an inclusive and transparent political process that strengthens national unity." I mean, what Kool-Aid is he drinking? Because that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, John Kerry's statement is absolutely ludicrous, but then he's a politician from a country which has extremely close ties to Saudi Arabia, which is the complete opposite of democracy, freedom, and human rights. But the Americans can talk about freedom in Ukraine, but they're very selective about it. And those elections that Kiev held a couple of weeks ago were a farce. They were a complete insult to democracy and an insult to millions of people in Ukraine. And why do I say that? Because the two traditional parties of southeastern Ukraine, the Party of Regions and the Communist Party, have been effectively destroyed since the coup this February. They've been subjected to violence. They've been kicked out, expelled from the Ukrainian parliament. And so people in Odessa, people in Kharkov, people in Kherson, for example, who in their millions in recent years, in the last 20 years since Ukraine's independence, they didn't go out to vote because their two parties were not there. So that was not an election. It was a very selective election. It was an election for pro-Western parties. And let's have a look at some of those pro-Western parties that took part in it. Neo-Nazis, ultra-nationalists, anti-Semites, they're all unified in their hatred of Russia and in their hatred of Jews and in their praise of those Ukrainians in Western Ukraine who collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War. It is absolutely disgraceful that in a major country in Europe.
I agree with you. Let me go to Dimitri here. Let me finish John Kerry's statement here, okay? Because it gets even better, okay? And look, I'm just continuing. The people of Ukraine have spoken. They have given, again, chosen the chart of a course of democracy, reform, and European integration. I find that really hard to believe that, you know, the people that are sitting in that Rada have European values. Marcus is right. I mean, they have an anti-Russia agenda. That's clear. But is that a pro-European agenda? Some of the things that are being said in that, well, will be said in this new parliament.
Well, that's confused. That's definitely confused. And I mean, John Kerry knows that, and pretty much everybody knows that. So that the pro-European course on the part of, Ukrainian nationalists, I mean, the landscape is what? Different hues of anti-Russian. I mean, that's the choice you've got. Pro-European, well, a lot of them, we know, are skeptical about Europe. A lot of them, if, you know, Ukraine were ever to join the EU, they would be indeed in a coalition with the most right-wing parties there. That we also have to understand. And that would actually affect the composition of the EU and its entire political course. But of course, that's hypothetical because Ukraine is not going to join the European Union anytime soon, not in the life of this generation. I want to go back to what Gilbert said about what we should be talking about now. And now we've got to be talking about the a fait accompli. The elections have been held. Where are the two sides heading?
Yep.
Now we are in for another frozen conflict. That seems to be a fact. I think that even though Angela Merkel on Tuesday castigated Russia for at least expressing respect for the result of the election, and well, of course, the angry statement from Kiev. And from Western capitals, I guess we're going to be hearing more of that. Anyway, I think everybody realizes that the East is not coming back. So what are they going to do on Tuesday also?
Go ahead, Gilbert. Hang on,
yes.
let's let Gilbert jump in here before we go to the break.
Here?
Go ahead, real quick.
I'd like to take issue with the point of a frozen conflict. It's not at all clear it's going to be a frozen conflict. It could be a very hot conflict. And I think that it's one thing to talk about the neo-Nazis, fascists. That's all very attractive subject matter, but it's not really what is the greatest threat at present. The greatest threat is a Russia-NATO war, and that threat is being advanced by Yatsenyuk.
Yep.
I had the benefit of briefing.
Gilbert, hold that thought. Hold that thought. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the recent elections in Ukraine. Okay, I'd like to go back to Gilbert in Brussels. Gilbert, you brought up some really interesting points in the first half of the program. Let's go talk about the possibility resumption of hostilities. We do know that most of the parties that will be in the new Rada are pro-war. And pro-European, this interesting mix here. What do you think the chances are of hostilities being reignited? Because it's still simmering there. And I'd like to throw with the background of all of this is economic meltdown. Is this going to be a diversion going after the East because they have no way to fix their very massive problems, not in the midterm, maybe not even in the long term? Go ahead, Gilbert, in Brussels.
Well, let's look at those parties. The balance in the Rada. At least you have close to 21% for Poroshenko, a little bit more for Yatsenyuk, and Yatsenyuk is tipped to be the prime minister. Now, those two parties are balanced, and it's easy to describe them as being equally pro-Western. It is ignoring the exceptional personality of Yatsenyuk and his lust for war with Russia. Mm-hmm. The question really is, in the coming days and weeks, whether or not Poroshenko can maintain control, or whether his party, which is more moderate, more reasonable, and more concerned about Ukrainian welfare than in glory of resuming a Ukrainian state through war with Russia, who is going to be the victor in this arm wrestling, Yatsenyuk or Poroshenko? I had the benefit of speaking this morning with one of the 15 European parliamentarians who was in the party of voter observation that went down for the 26th and stayed a little bit afterwards to see the vote counting. He was one of two who went outside of Kiev and had his own request was in Dnipropetrovsk, together with one was a Czech and one was a German, and they found massive cases of violence, intimidation, which they have documented and which they'll eventually be presenting to their peers in the European Parliament. But they also had a meeting, they were present at the meeting that Poroshenko, Yatsenyuk, and Turchinov gave to this 15-man European Parliament delegation. And my interlocutor said, it was very clear that Yatsenyuk stood apart from his from his colleagues in the ruling party and in the pro-Western parties as being particularly violent and particularly interested in a war, which he now predicts for the spring. In answer to your direct question, does this have is it playing out the economic catastrophe? Of course it is.
Okay.
The situation is
let me go to Marcus here. Because it's really interesting here because, again, Western media likes to phrase things and frame things in a very simplistic way. It's anti-Russian, pro-European. But, in fact, if you look at the parties that are going to be sitting in the Rada, it's really just more oligarchs fighting each other to control and to loot the state, okay? Yanukovych was just one of many that did it, okay? And now we have a new set of them coming in and doing it. They just wear their nice pro-Western face, okay, and a nice tie. But it's no different, okay? And if they can't solve the problems with the East, which they won't, and they can't solve their economic problems at home, they will go to war with each other. That is the Ukrainian way, at least since 1991. Marcus in London, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Ever since Ukraine became an independent state in 1991, it has been run in a very bad way. It's been run by businessmen who are only interested in themselves and not with the well-being and the lives of the ordinary person in Ukraine. But when we talk about European values, and as you said, Peter, Western media likes to talk about how Ukraine has now turned decisively to the West. It's adopted European values. I mean, that is absolute nonsense, but it's predictable drivel from these Western journalists. European values exist only on paper. Every single year in Estonia and Latvia, there are Waffen-SS veteran parades. Is that condemned by Western media outlets? Is that condemned by European Union member state governments? No. A few weeks ago, we had the grotesque spectacle in Ukraine of neo-Nazi parades in Odessa and in Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk, for example. Did that make headlines, for example, in the BBC, in Sky News? Absolutely not. So these European values, they sound very nice and they are very nice on paper, but the European Union applies them in a very selective way. And quite frankly, the people who now reside in the Ukrainian parliament have nothing in common with those values on paper. They are absolutely despicable and they should hold no positions of power whatsoever. They wouldn't be tolerated in Britain, and quite rightly so. They wouldn't be tolerated in Germany, and quite rightly so. But they're tolerated in Ukraine because the European Union and the West is intent on tearing Ukraine away from Russia, bringing it into its orbit, into the European Union, eventually into NATO, in order to isolate Russia on its western borders. The West has a long, dubious history of working alongside some repugnant groups, be it the Contras, be it Islamists, and today, neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Let's be categorically clear about what the West is all about when it comes to its foreign policy.
Dimitri, also in London, what is your thoughts about the possibility of a renewed conflict here? Gilbert has mentioned spring. I mean, can they really afford it? And like I said, would it be a diversion here? Because the Donbass stood up for itself in late summer, and it's maintaining itself right now. And if for good or better, these elections have just shown a divorce. How much do you accept that? And how much is it worth to the regime in Kiev to go to war that is very, very expensive? How much is the West going to back it up? I mean, and again, the competitions and the rivalries within the regime in Kiev. It seems that there are no good outcomes here. Maybe you should just look after the economy first. Go ahead, Dimitri.
Well, I think, first of all, I think Western countries need to realize at some point, quite soon, that we're very close to the edge. And if we don't turn back, then indeed a hot war, as Gilbert suggested, is possible, but I don't think it's still conceivable for Europe or for Russia. It is conceivable for Kiev. And yes, they're sort of gunning. I started to say that on Tuesday, a motion was submitted to the nation's parliament to abrogate that agreement that sort of recognized limited autonomy for Lugansk and Donetsk. Well, to start with, Lugansk and Donetsk never were happy with that original proposition, so they're just plowing their own course. One other thing about East Ukraine, is, I think, to note that they've been, I guess a lot of people there might feel bitter about what they perceive as lack of Russia's support.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So they have realized that they have to go it alone.
Yep.
And I think the election, the mood of the people, and the statements by the people that ran in the elections, it all shows that they are, pretty resolved to go it alone. They will form whatever country they're trying to shape. And that country, perhaps idealistic, but they talk about fairness. They talk about absence of corruption. They want to talk about rule of the people. They want a judicial system that is run by the people. So paradoxically, I mean, that is really the amazing thing, is that the original Maidan in Kiev was pressing exactly for those things.
Exactly. A very interesting point. Dimitri, let me go to Gilbert here, because that's a very interesting point. The true values that I think all of us here would agree with that were played out of the Maidan and later was hijacked is actually happening in the Donbass. That's a really remarkable observation. Also, Dimitri said something I think is really important here, is that so many people outside of the echo chamber don't understand is that in the east of Ukraine, and many Russians here in the country that I live in don't believe that Russia and President Putin has done enough for the people of the East. And that whole debate is never even brought up in the West because it doesn't seem to exist in the minds of Western politicians and media. But if you come on the ground, it's a patently obvious point of discussion. Go ahead, Gilbert.
No, I agree with your observation. President Putin has been very cautious, though he's easily painted as a nationalist in Western media. That is totally inaccurate. He is a realist. He is looking after Russian national interests, and what Russia would gain by a more partisan approach in the southeast is not at all clear.
Yep.
What it would lose is very clear. It would very easily justify, in the eyes of the West, but also not only in the West, a more stern reproach and heightened isolation. He is trying to avoid that. He sees nothing positive to be gained, and so yes, it's clear that the Donbass residents will be disappointed.
Yes. Marcus, where do we go from here? Because I think it's been some really good observations on this program here, is that the Donbass, they have to go it alone because there's no one else is going to help them. Now, of course, there are individuals in Russia that do cross the border and do help them, and there's no denying of that. But the dilemma that Gilbert just mentioned is out there for Russia, and does the West really want to have a hot war over Ukraine?
Well, I actually happen to believe the West is prepared for that. I'm not so sure that when it comes to it, Poroshenko would want a full conflict with Russia because he would lose. But I think in the long term, the Americans, to an extent, the Americans and the Europeans, to an extent, now have an advantage in Ukraine because it's the first time in Ukraine's history, and as an independent state, that they managed to get a pro-Western president into power through a coup. What happened with Yushchenko was very different, but they crossed a red line this February, the West, when they engineered that coup. So I believe that they, feel upbeat about the situation, and I believe they are going to pursue their goal of trying to bring
Okay, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We've run out of time here. I just wonder if the West really wants to pay for Ukraine. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Brussels, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.